Hello Hwa Chong students, I'm Mr. Tan again. So in this video lecture, I'll be covering the topic of globalization for this lesson. So what we will cover in this video is that we will first talk about the benefits as well as the costs of globalization. We'll be applying the benefits and the costs on the Singapore context as applied to Essay 6. Then we'll end off with policies that Singapore used to mitigate the costs of globalization. First, let's talk about the definition of globalization. So if you recall in the previous video that I did on economic integration, when we talk about common market, right, we talk about free flow, free trade in goods and services, as well as free movement of capital and labor. So it is the same definition as we will use for globalization. Basically, globalization is that goods and services will flow freely across countries without being taxed. We also allow FDI to flow, and we also allow labor to move. So when it comes to benefits and costs, right, here are some tips I can use. As far as you can, try to link them to either the macro goals or the micro goals. So there are basically 4 macro goals and 2 micro goals. The micro goals are efficiency and equity, in case you have forgotten. So there are many possible points you can use for benefits and costs, but the easiest way is to be able to link to either of these goals. Next, when you explain, right, bias your choice of goals towards points where you can easily show using the aggregate demand and aggregate supply diagram, so that you can always put an ADAS graph in your analysis in order to score the analysis marks. And of course, as far as you can, learn to use the appropriate economic terms. The final tip I can say is that you will find that the topic of globalization, the term globalization, can be applied to any questions in economics, micro and macro. So in the past exams, I've seen the globalization applied to demand and supply, applied to market structure, applied to market failure, and of course applied to every topic that you can see for macroecon. So think about how you fit the definition of globalization into all these topics. The easiest way that I'll tell my students typically when it comes to the benefits is to use FDI. The main benefit of using FDI is this: if you have been paying attention in the ADAS lessons that we have taught you since J1, FDI is part of the investment component of the AD curve. So when FDI flows into the country, the first thing you can say is that the aggregate demand will increase. Okay, the investment expenditure part of the C plus I plus G plus X minus M will increase. So this will shift AD to the right. So long as there are some unemployed factors of production, you can first explain the benefit in terms of actual growth. Then as you move your AD across the horizontal or the diagonal part of the AS curve, you can easily show that the cyclical unemployment will be lower. So that's really 2 potential goals, 2 goals being hit. And finally, if you have been paying attention in lectures, what we tell is that investment, right, in the long run will tend to translate to more capital goods. So when there are more capital goods that comes in, okay, and even with technological flow, you can also explain that there will be potential growth in the long run. So you'll shift the LRAS to the right. So you can see that easily by using FDI and ADAS, you can hit already a few goals, a few of the macro goals all at once. So let's try to explain, right, linking to Essay 6. Singapore, right, ever since we declare our independence from Malaysia, we have been attracting FDI. Okay, this is an important priority for us to generate jobs for our workers. We did have a brief period of protectionism. We call this import substitution, when Singapore was still part of Malaysia between the years of 1959 to 1964. But ever since we separated from Malaysia in 1964, we have been basically embracing free trade. So you can use your ADAS, like I've shown in the previous slides, to show all the gains to the macro goals. More recently, right, in the early 2000s, it's not just about free trade in goods, free trade of services, not just about attracting FDI. We have been also opening our labor market to facilitate easier immigration of foreign workers. So what you can say is that this allows Singapore, right, to develop comparative advantage in new areas such as medical tourism and resorts. So think of resorts, think of our Resort World Sentosa, our Universal Studios. without the availability of, let's say, foreign workers to work in these resorts, without the availability of attracting foreign doctors and foreign nurses to work in our Mount Elizabeth, our Parkway hospitals, there's no way we'll be able to develop such comparative advantage in these sectors. So you can think of this labor migration as a way for changing our factor endowment to be more, to be slightly more labor abundant, allowing us to develop a comparative advantage in such areas as well. So these are some of the important benefits of globalization to Singapore. What about the costs of globalization? So as usual, you should link it to macro goals. So your notes have many different costs, right? So I will just focus on these three: the economic contagion, structural unemployment, and income inequality. Now, the underlying cost of globalization, the underlying reason for the cost of globalization is the same as the reason for the cost of free trade that we have covered before. In the real world, right, factors of production are not perfectly mobile across sectors. So just like free trade, when a country opens its doors to FDI, opens its doors to labor immigration, okay, there will be some industries that we have to downsize or even shut down, those industries that you don't have a comparative advantage in. But because factors of production are not perfectly mobile, those workers who are in those sectors, those industries where Singapore doesn't have a CA in, they will be structurally unemployed. They will be unable to find jobs in the new sectors that Singapore does have a CA in. So the workers that are typically into this area, that those are really those workers that really cannot move, right, are typically the older workers who have less education. So these workers, right, they'll tend to suffer from structural unemployment. As a result, they are also earning less income. So that is the point about structural unemployment and income inequality. For economic contagion, right, you can easily again use ADAS to analyze. The key is that Singapore's exports tend to be income elastic. So when the world is doing very well, the demand for our exports will rise more than proportionally. However, when there's an economic downturn in our trading partners, okay, as their GDP falls, because the demand for our exports tend to be income elastic, the demand for exports will then fall by more than proportionate. So that's how you explain economic contagion using ADAS. So how do we mitigate the cost of globalization? What kind of policies does Singapore use to mitigate the cost? So in general, right, do be aware that Singapore, we do not resort to protectionism, nor do we ever contemplate ever withdrawing from globalization. So if you recall what we show you in your tutorial lessons for, let's say, essay question 4 or other case study 10-mark questions on whether protectionism is better or free trade is better, okay, the general conclusion we tend to show you is that Singapore, right, for a small and open economy like Singapore, embracing free trade, embracing globalization is the correct policy to go for. But how do we mitigate the cost of globalization? Instead of withdrawing from globalization, instead of imposing tariffs, we focus more on supply-side policies, basically to improve occupational mobility, especially for the older workers. So that those workers, right, those aged 40 and above, which lack a university education, if they are structurally unemployed due to the free trade and globalization, with suitable supply-side policies to retrain them, they can more easily move and take up new jobs in new sectors. So this is about free trade in goods. However, I do agree that in many countries, even in Singapore, labor flow, right, the free flow of labor tend to be resisted far more than free trade of goods and services as well as capital. So for example, Brexit was largely driven by UK's desire, the British desire, to control which workers who gets into their country. They are fine with free trade in goods and services. They are very happy with FDI, but they tend to resist labor flow. So this is also true for Singapore. So in this case, right, Singapore, we do have certain measures to encourage firms, right, to hire locals rather than foreigners. So you can think of this as some kind of protectionistic measure, but it's more towards the free flow of labor rather than FDI nor goods. So number one, we have a dependency ratio ceiling. Okay, this basically sets a limit to how many, what's the proportion of workers in your workforce, in the company's workforce, that can be foreigners. So for a simple example, right, if the DRC, the dependency ratio ceiling, is 50%, it means that for a firm to hire one foreigner, they have to hire at least one local. So you want to have 5 foreigners, you must at least hire 5 locals. So this is called a DRC. We also have a foreign worker levy, which is a kind of a tax. So if the DRC is a quota, the foreign worker levy is a form of tax. Then finally, we have things like work permit, S-pass, and employment pass rules. So to basically, right, work permits are foreign workers, right, that are basically like construction workers, domestic help. These are the low skilled workers. S-pass workers are those workers with the skills that what a polytechnic graduate in Singapore can go for. These are typically the technician jobs. And of course, when it comes to university grads, okay, employment pass. If you want to hire a foreign worker based on employment pass, these are the workers where they are typically competing with jobs with our local university graduates. So for example, right, to apply for employment pass to hire a foreign worker, you must pay a minimum salary for the foreign worker for them to qualify for employment pass. And we also have this thing called a fair consideration framework. So for a firm in Singapore to hire a foreign worker on an employment pass, they have to advertise the jobs for locals in the jobs banks first. Okay, and they have to make sure that the advertisement, the job banks, last for at least 2 weeks. Okay, jobs banks, right? Only Singaporeans and PRs can apply for jobs in the jobs bank. Only after you interview enough PRs and Singaporeans, only after you manage to interview them, if you still find them not suitable, then the MOM, the Minister of Manpower, will approve the employment pass for foreign workers. So these are basically some of the measures that we use to slow down the growth in foreign workers, the hiring of foreign workers in Singapore. Okay, thank you.